We begin this news hour in Iran, where the Russian President Vladimir Putin and President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey are visiting for a summit with their Iranian counterpart Ibrahim Raisi. This is only President Putin's second foreign trip since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The talks are expected to focus on Syria. The three countries have all been involved in the conflict there and are trying to restore stability under the so-called Astana peace process. The war in Ukraine is also expected to be on the agenda. Turkey has been negotiating with Moscow and Kyiv for the export of Ukrainian grain, while Iran and Russia are seeking new trade routes to bypass sanctions. Well, let's bring in Arise chief correspondent John Cookson for more on this. Good to see you, John. The official line is that the summit is discussing Syria, but Ukraine will no doubt be on the agenda, as will finding new trade routes to bypass sanctions.
You're slightly breaking. That is on the agenda, but more importantly, I think for these three leaders plus Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the spiritual leader of Iran, the big question is what to do about Syria. Turkey is on the other side of things as far as the war is concerned. Turkey supporting anti-al-Assad forces in Syria, whereas the Russians and the Iranians are supporting the Damascus regime. And Turkey is planning a major offensive in northern Syria. Now, it's thought that these talks will focus on persuading Turkey not to create a so-called buffer zone that it wants to create, it says, for security reasons because of the threat, Turkey's perceived threat from PKK military supporting Kurdish forces in northern Syria. It wants to create a buffer zone between Turkey and those forces. And it may well be that Turkey will be persuaded not to carry out the offensive, or at least perhaps do it on just a limited scale. Talking of sanctions, yes, of course, Russia is subject to Western sanctions, of course, since the invasion of Ukraine. And Iran has been under Western sanctions for, well, frankly, since the revolution in 1979. So both countries have a way of getting around sanctions. And indeed, both economies, Charles, that's the Russian and the Iranian economies, are doing reasonably well at the moment, despite the sanctions. The Russian ruble is very strong, and the Iranian economy is in reasonable shape. Of course, it's an oil country, and there's much demand for Iranian oil. Charles.
And John, I hope you can hear me now. If you can, nod vigorously. Brilliant. Right, so you were talking about Iran and Russia, because certainly one key thing that they both have in common is heavy international sanctions. And presumably Russia thinks that it can learn something from Iran about how to live under sanctions and how to circumvent sanctions.
Well, I'm not sure about that, Charles. I'm sure Russia knows all about getting around sanctions. And remember, it still has good relations with China, and China very supportive still of Russia. And there are many countries that are seeking Russian fuel, including oil and gas. So I'm not sure that Russia is looking for a way to get around sanctions. Iran is well used to it. The country survived sanctions, as I say, for decades, and it does have friends around the world. So to go back to that point about sanctions, I think it's a little bit down the list. The top of the agenda is Syria. And second, I would have thought, is trying to get some breakthrough on grain. That's millions of tons of grain that are stacked up in in Ukrainian ports and on ships waiting for export. And there is a tentative agreement between the UN, Russia, Turkey, and Ukraine, and there may well be some kind of breakthrough announced during this visit by Putin to Tehran. There's a state dinner tonight and a press conference, and maybe we'll hear more about that. I'll have one more go at trying getting back to you, Charles. Back to you.
Well, I can hear you loud and clear, John. So, and you appear to be hearing me. So that's a step in the right direction. There's also the question, isn't there, John, of military cooperation between Moscow and Tehran. There've been reports that Iran is selling hundreds of weapons-capable drones to Russia for use in Ukraine. I mean, do we have confirmation of that, and reports that Iran is also keen to buy Russian military hardware?
You're absolutely right. I've seen reports today that Russia is seeking to deepen ties with Tehran, but look, there's been closeness between Russia and Iran for decades now, especially since the Second World War, and even through the revolution. Those ties between Moscow and Tehran are very strong. Putin has met with the Iranian leader at least 5 times during his presidency, and the ties between Russia and Iran always have been, and now still are, very strong. What Russia is trying to get is the Iranians are very good at making arms, and in particular drones that can be used in the battlefield in Ukraine. And it's said that Putin is trying to strike a deal with Iran to get his hands on thousands of these drones from the Iranians. Interestingly, the Turks also have drones, and they're supplying them to the Ukrainians. So you can see how complicated this relationship is between Turkey, Iran, and Russia, with Turkey finding itself on the opposite sides of conflict. Turkey on the opposite side of Russia in Syria and in Libya, and indeed in Ukraine. So interesting times. But yes, I think an arms deal will come out of this, but we won't hear the detail. I'm convinced of that. And how can we be sure that drones made in Iran are identified in Ukraine? It's just impossible to find out.
Sounds absolutely compelling, your analysis there, John. Thank you very much indeed. John Cookson, Arise Chief Correspondent, talking to me there from London. And of course,